When you think of gacha game communities, it's almost always a mixed bag. There are great stories, sure, like the amazing fan creations, art, and content that these communities create. But there are also many horror stories, especially when it comes to the most unhinged part of these communities. The nature of gacha games, with the heavy integration of real-world money in many of their mechanics, oftentimes breeds communities that are hyper-fixated on numbers like revenue and player count. After all, when players stop spending, that's when these games end their service. And with how sunk costs work, nobody wants to see anything that they've invested their time, money, or dedication into disappear. What this means is that many of these communities view the gacha games they play and their developers as something that needs defending. If the community doesn't justify every single decision a dev makes, that would be bad. But what if there was a dev that did the opposite? A dev that openly welcomed critique of the game and immediately took action to make it better. Wouldn't that foster a community that's far more accepting of improvements, instead of the many existing ones that believe that their developers can never do wrong? Honest feedback that's acted upon is how games get better. And Wuthering Waves, with Kuro as its developer, is a company that embodies that mentality. Today we'll be breaking down why this is the case, diving into how Kuro is setting the tone for Wuthering Waves and its community from the top down, how Wuthering Waves has fostered a community that's far more open to critiques and improvements, and how this mindset has already improved the game significantly. As always, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Several months after the launch of Wuthering Waves, ripe with its highly publicized issues, the CEO of Kuro Games, Solon, had some choice words for the player base. I think as long as you can survive, that's enough, right? Besides that, love yourself alongside the players, love the game, and love your team. With these three principles, you'll be able to run a long-term gaming business. These heartfelt words were coupled with some of the best quality of life updates the game had seen thus far. With these words and actions, Solon confirmed a few things. First was that Wuthering Waves wasn't a game trying to make the most money possible through their monetization strategies. That's evident enough by the fact you're able to purchase dupes of limited 5-star characters in the store, the fact that the weapon banner is completely guaranteed, and the fact that the overall 5-star rates are higher than their competitors while having a significantly lower pity. Any person who's spent in Wuthering Waves, in comparison to some of the top games in the market, understands that they're getting far more value relative to those peers. Second was that Wuthering Waves players knew that Kuro acknowledged and would actually listen to their complaints. Incredible acts of compensation like the massive number of pulls and free standard characters for the launch troubles had players feeling like their complaints were being heard. And what that meant was that these complaints were actually worth making and weren't being sent into a black hole, much like those made in other games. When Kuro led the industry with these sweeping updates to improve the overall experience for players, and actual industry leaders had to follow in their footsteps, this only further reinforced a constructive mindset across the community when it came to their suggestions to improve the game. Other communities were seeing how Kuro raised the bar, and were demanding the same for their games. All of that toxic positivity, bred through years of Hoyoverse games leading the market, is slowly disappearing, and the end result is that gacha games as a whole are becoming a much better experience for all players. However, this wasn't the case very early on in Wuthering Waves' release. Gacha tribalism and that very same sense of toxic positivity was very strong back in those days. And what this meant was that a huge number of content creators and players who had critiques for Wuthering Waves were facing the same kind of backlash that we had seen in prior gacha titles. Don't believe me? Let's take a look at one of my older videos, how to make Wuthering Waves better. In this video, I highlighted several gameplay features within Zenless Zone Zero that I thought would be great additions to Wuthering Waves. Things like an expedited daily system that would give a greater reward for spending wave plates. Things like more interactivity with playable characters in the overworld. Things like adding more replayability to the Elusive Realm. These were suggestions that, on paper, weren't too unreasonable, and would, without a doubt, improve the game for many players. But how dare I say that Kuro did something wrong? This video got completely obliterated, with one of the worst dislike ratios I'd ever seen. People had some very familiar responses to these suggestions. Things like, Wuwa is an open world, daily should take more time, you're just asking to play the game less, the elusive realm is perfect as it is. These were the same exact type of replies we'd see to any suggested improvement to games like Genshin Impact. And when Hoyoverse, the developers, would go ahead and ignore all of these suggestions to improve their game, this only further reinforced the mindset that the developers knew best and never had to listen to their players. And what did Kuro do instead? They went ahead and implemented all of these changes that I had previously gotten raked over the coals for. They increased the wave played daily from 20 points to 60. They added interactivity with playable characters in the overworld, and they added more rewards and a refresh to the elusive realm. The developers are the people that set the tone for their game's community. If a developer refuses to act on feedback, that sends a strong message to the community. Anybody critiquing our game is wrong. And that drives the mindset across its players that there is something wrong with people who don't like everything about the game, and that's toxic positivity. By implementing so many changes and updates this early on in the game's lifecycle, Kuro has effectively opened the door to a far healthier community dynamic where players and content creators aren't afraid to point out when something is bad or needs improvement. When content creators were running the risk of losing their communities or viewership for having any negative opinion about the game, that heavily influences the content that they create as well. In Wuthering Waves, that fear has been quelled, and it couldn't have happened without the actions of the developers. And now this one developer, Kuro Games, they're bringing this mindset of constructive feedback over to games that have had millions, if not billions more in budget, a much larger player base, and far more years of developer experience. Kuro Games has set the benchmark when it comes to a developer interacting with their community, and now the Wuthering Waves community is easily the strongest it's ever been. There simply aren't as many people doom posting the August revenue numbers. People know that it's a filler patch with slightly less desirable characters, and people understand what Kuro is doing. You can say a lot of things about Kuro Games, but one thing for certain is that they truly do love their players. As always, if you enjoyed this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Peace out.